and welcome to College Misericordia, and welcome to our two-day conference on very successful alternative public schools, which is being sponsored by the Earth Heart Foundation and which is being coordinated by an alumnus of College Misericordia, Dr. Daria Brzezinski, who we have all grown to love and respect, and we can't figure out when she sleeps. Fabulous lady. To begin our program today, we are very fortunate to have Congressman Paul Kanjorski with us. Congressman Kanjorski is a gentleman who not only understands education, but supports education, and in his support, he tells us that good enough is never good enough, and with that, he challenges us always to be better and better at the process of education and to devote ourselves to this very, very important endeavor. College Misericordia is especially proud of the Congressman, and we are very, very happy that he is with us this morning. Congressman Kanjorski.
Good morning. Thank you very much. These last few nights have been late nights for me. If you remember what happened yesterday, I had to stay up with the news. But I'm pleased to be here, and I do have the answer to Daria's energy. I know her mother, and she's her mother's daughter. That's all, as simple as that. I am pleased to be here, and when Daria invited me to the conference to start it off, I saw it as a great opportunity to talk with people that are obviously going to approach education with an open mind and a new approach. And particularly for northeastern Pennsylvania, education, in my estimation, is the most important investment we can make. We've made a lot of strides in a lot of areas, but clearly if we're going to continue our economic development in this area with the challenges and with the quality of life that we want our citizens to have, the one major factor that we have to improve is skill, training, and education. And when Daria visited me in Washington, we discussed that. I have some thoughts on the subject, and I'll just share them with you briefly. One, over the last 14 years as a member of Congress, I've had a great opportunity every Thanksgiving to devote 2 days of my life interviewing the finalists for the military academy appointments. And so over that period of time, I've interviewed almost 1,000 students from the general 40 high schools that are in my congressional district. And I am always amazed with that every year the applicants seem to be brighter, better equipped, and more challenging. And yet on the other hand, I run across other students from our area and I study the SATs and the grades, and I start to see that there's a distinct difference. In some instances, the students of excellence in the upper 50 percentile of their classes seem to be on course and doing very well and being very competitive nationally. There's a great lacking in our area of capturing the opportunity and the talents of the lower 50 percentile of our students. For whatever reason, I'm not sure, but with Doria's suggestion of looking at education perhaps in a new way and trying to meet the challenge by addressing the total individual, I think if that has any offer or help in working in the process, we should certainly pursue it. Education, however, beyond my congressional district and the country as a whole and the world, I think that clearly the 21st century, the nations that are called upon to lead the 21st century certainly have to have the best equipped minds and the best equipped talents. And clearly America is in that position of the leading superpower of the world, but we won't long continue in that realm unless we find some new ways of reaching and stimulating our youth and our young people, and I dare say our college and graduate school level. I spoke yesterday before the Bar Association, and an interesting issue came up to me from one of the judges that was sitting in the audience, and he suggested the fact that we have this problem with financing college educations, and this idea that anyone can get an education because they can borrow, and then when they graduate from college or graduate school they can pay it back. And that's troubled me because I've been a supporter of the concept of the GI Bill of Rights and heavy involvement in financing education as an investment for the country. And I think when you make it available only as a debt factor for students, they carry such heavy debt when they enter private life that we're also now losing a lot of the leadership that they normally give to the community, because they have to spend so much time in concentrating either in their professions or occupations to pay that long-term debt back. It sort of reminds me of the concept of the company store, if you will. We are denying our best talents in the country from expressing themselves and working in not only their vocations, but in their avocations and their community leadership as we have in the past. And I think the community can suffer from that lack of concentration on paying back a debt for education, when in fact, I think we should approach it in no different way than we approach other infrastructure and investments in our society. We do not ask everyone to contribute equally to highway systems. We know that highway systems are necessary for transportation and for the economy to move along and for the country to progress. Education is the same way. I think putting a cost factor on an individual because of their abilities or their talents and assuming that they can replenish the coffers through interest and debt is very detrimental to our society. And I think then as you move on into the primary and secondary levels, we see the same thing. The disparagement of expenditures on education from one district to another. I think we have a community in Fairfax, Virginia. The average primary and secondary student has about $13,000 a year expended on it, and we have some districts here in Pennsylvania where it doesn't rise to a little over $4,000 a year. Not that money in itself will cure a problem, but clearly where you have a disadvantage in terms of assets, whether it be books, libraries, teachers, the internet, or anything else that are necessary as tools today for education, to not have a more equally balanced expenditure and quality of schools or types of schools available to all students so that those with various talents can reach their highest levels and potentialities. I think it's a fundamental mistake of our country's policy as we move through. So I hope this conference that gathers today recognizes that it's not only money, but it is also money. It's not only national testing or individual testing or these issues that we talk about in public life. It's much more fundamental than that. I hope for this area, this conference can make an analysis that within our existing budget or whatever we need above that budget, we can certainly increase the quality of education at all levels, but particularly concentrating at the lower 50 percentile that for all intents and purposes today, they are disadvantaged in a major way. I'm not sure that at a governmental level we've been very successful. We've taken education on as a political issue in both parties with the idea of bumper sticker mentality. Everyone has a very simplistic answer, whether it's vouchers on the Republican side or national testing on the Democratic side. Actually, these are little, very small parts of maybe something that should be done. But unfortunately, the nation as a community has not had a discussion of these issues. They've really not attacked the idea and concept of who deserves education, whether it should be open to everyone, whether it should be free education at all levels, and how we finance it, and then how we utilize the assets that exist in our society. I talked with one of the presidents of one of the universities yesterday on the concept of Pennsylvania is gifted with the dual system, the public system and the private system. The public system seems to get all the emphasis on assets today. The private system of colleges and universities are literally being starved to death. Is that a wise use of assets when all the expenditures and investments are already made on campuses such as Misericordia, that at some point in the future it could disappear from existence and we'd rely merely on the public system? We're never going to answer those problems well as elected officials and from a governmental level unless we have the community and all the citizens participate in that analysis and that study and make recommendations and then make them issues. Our system ultimately comes down to a political system, a representative system. we have to, in our process of making our analysis, then make sure that it gets implemented. And the only way that happens is make sure that our elected officials are forced to address those issues as they run for office. And if they don't stand well along the propositions that are acceptable to the population as to what should be done in the future, it doesn't really matter to a large extent what their positions are on so many other issues. Because for all intents and purposes, they're telling us that they really don't care about the long-term advantage of this country and its competitiveness and the world. And we will be missing that strong opportunity that America has in the 21st century. I have a lot of agreement with the President's position, if for no other reason that he has put education at the top of our issues in government today. And since we have peace and prosperity, what is a better time for the country to concentrate? And I think also he recognizes, as Daria recognizes, that it isn't money alone. It isn't some magic wand of a voucher system or a testing system. It's using our creative juices now with all the alternatives that we have in finding what has been successful and what has been good, and to use the Best Practices Institute, as I call it. Whoever's solving a problem, wherever they're solving it, if they're doing a good job and they're successful, let us not be so egotistical to think that it wasn't our thought, it therefore shouldn't be pursued. And whatever we should do, I think in both parties politically, we should not use education as a bumper sticker mentality type of program where it's something that we want to sell and sell only that. I think all of us as public officials have the responsibility to causing a discussion, a communication to be had with the community. I think the burden of educators is to make sure that that issue, now that it has come to the forefront, remains on the forefront. The 106th Congress of the United States, when it reconvenes in January, should have education as its top issue. The legislatures of all 50 states should have education as their top issue. It clearly is a top issue. We are not in fear of war. We are not now engaged in any economic catastrophe that can't be handled, although there can. There may be one. But without a well-educated electorate, what decisions will be made on the other issues of government? How often do our citizens fail to really understand some of the penetrating issues that affect the country because of their lack of understanding some of the concepts involved that are necessary to resolve the issues? So I take my hat off to everyone that came out in the early morning hours on a Saturday. Obviously, I'm talking and preaching to the choir, but it's the choir that can start the tune that will be heard around the world. And clearly, it should be heard around the United States, and particularly around Pennsylvania, because even though we're the Keystone State, we're falling behind in so many areas, including education. And I have to tell you, representing the 11th Congressional District of Northeastern Pennsylvania, it is our major failing. The ability to solve many of our economic problems are directly related to the failure to have used the talents of our people and to the resources of our local society to bring people to the level of attracting the type of jobs, the type of opportunities, and the type of income that would make us equal with the rest of the world. So we, as a local society and community, can never move ahead to share in the national largesse or take our rightful place in the quality of life of this country unless we recognize that we at presently are not delivering the package of education that our students and our community needs. And I welcome Doria's conference here today from the standpoint that I'm sure you're going to be examining so many of those concepts that she has experienced in her travels. And I hope we can find some of them that we can relate to our school districts. I know we have an awful lot of physical buildings in this area that we can use for other purposes and other physical conditions. It's now what we need are the ideas and the agreed upon consensus of what efforts should be undertaken to improve our primary, our secondary, our college, and our graduate system locally. so that we can be competitive with the world. So thank you very much for having me. Think hard, work hard, and I'm looking forward to whatever your conclusions are made in your final analysis. I'm holding Daria responsible to give me a paper on that. Thank you.
Before you leave, Congressman Kanjorski, on behalf of Earth Heart Foundation, we are totally grateful for you and your dedication to as an inspiring visionary in education in the Wyoming Valley.
We're all very proud of Daria, but she really had nothing to do with this conference. I think we need to congratulate the people who really put it together. The various students that she's been working to the bone over the last several weeks. We're very fortunate. She's very fortunate. College of Misericordia is very fortunate to have so many students participate in this endeavor. And I think I'd like to start the morning by asking all the students who worked so hard to put this together to stand up. Daria and Congressman Kanjorski and the rest of us can be assured that these people will be ready to prepare our nation's youth. These are the teachers of the future. And with the exception of John, I think they're all going to be excellent. He never sleeps. He's a wonderful guy. I have an opportunity now to introduce a gentleman that I worked with for a good long time here at College of Misericordia, a person who made an enormous difference in the futures of students and in preparing teachers. A gentleman who has, since leaving College Misericordia, turned pro golfer. Or maybe he's not a pro golfer, maybe he just turned pro golf storyteller. But at any rate, he knows Daria. So I'd like to introduce my friend, Arnie Gehringer.
Thank you, Joseph. It truly feels good to be back on campus. I find it rather interesting that 30 years ago this fall, I attended meetings for new faculty members in this very room after learning that working as a secondary school principal in Philadelphia was no way to enjoy my love of teaching. As a father of 4 children, ages 5 and younger, plus holding one of my degrees from Villanova, I thought I might pass off as a Catholic. And so I neglected to mention that I was a Methodist married to a Baptist minister's daughter during the interviewing process. Years later, after I got tenure, of course, I confided that omission to President Sister Miriam Teresa, who confided in return to me that the Mercy Order knew very well of my religious persuasion years ago, but they were also well aware of this diversity looming on the horizon, and I was chosen to become their token Protestant. The rest is 30 years of wonderful history. That's absolutely true, both those stories. The first faculty person I got to know well was my department chair, John Mullaney, who unfortunately was taken from us and the business of education much too early. And I would give anything if John could be here today, because in the fall of 1969, I met his young work-study person and remembered how proud he was of this young lady and the potential he saw in this future educator. However, I think even John would be amazed if he could see the stunning credentials amassed over the years by his diminutive protege. As an earned master and doctorate from Westbrook University, a myriad of personal appearances on national radio and television, lectures at prestigious colleges and institutes, conferences all over the country, and enough publications to make even the most prolific writer very jealous. In fact, her professional vita makes me so happy and proud that I don't wish to hear myself talk anymore, and those who know me well will attest that this phenomena has never happened before. I just want our guest of honor to know, from my perspective, it's very nice to be remembered after a long period of time. It's even nicer to be remembered fondly enough to be asked to share the stage and set the stage for this morning. With that in mind, ladies and gentlemen, please help me warmly welcome home Dr. Daria Brzezinski.
I'm certainly glad he didn't make me cry. He threatened to do that. Good morning. I'm going to attempt to do a 5-hour lecture in an hour. So bear with me if I talk too quickly. I hope I don't. The function of education is to teach one to think intensively and to think critically. Intelligence plus character, that is the goal of true education. Spoken by Martin Luther King. I'd like to dedicate this conference to several teachers. Sister Carmel here at College Misericordia, who taught us the soul of music. John Mullaney, who taught us a bag of tricks and to always be prepared. Mr. Nemizhnok, my high school geometry teacher, who taught me the poetry of geometry, and Barbara Kessler, who taught me to believe in myself. I'd like to also thank, before I start, Congressman Kanjorski as a visionary in this community. Our sponsors, Sally May, who's represented here today by Joe Bailey, and Kristen Pearsall. The Luzerne County Business and Education Partnership, whose representatives today are Anita Woznia and Sue Spry. College Misericordia for welcoming us with open arms. Dr. Mike McDowell, Sister Mary Glennon, and of course, Joe Rogan, and the Circle of Light Foundation with Dr. Fahmy and Bob Butts. We already know that it takes an entire community to raise a child. Large or small, it's a community of educators, businesses, and families that will determine the direction of education for the 21st century. Education must be returned back to the community in which it resides for schooling to affect a child's life. Within this sphere, a new dimension of how learning takes place must prevail. Earth Heart Foundation has discovered, and I'm sure you all have as well, that a phenomenon will occur in the next 5 to 10 years, one that will change the course of history, we believe, and prepare ourselves appropriately. Across the nation, 40–50% of educators, superintendents, principals, and teachers, the baby boomers, will be retiring. In the state of Pennsylvania, we anticipate a 45% turnover. This means that the time is ripe to create teacher training programs that will affect education for the next century. The focus of the new programs that must take place, a strong emphasis, we feel, on learning strategies rather than textbooks, testing, and teacher-centered classrooms. Earth Heart has discovered that some of the essential elements for successful schools, and of course, we have here today many of the people who represent these successful elements. I'm only going to give you some of them because they are quite numerous. And I'm going to go through them very quickly because I have so much material I'd like to cover within an hour. So if you have any questions or would like any explanations, we have plenty of time over the weekend to talk. One of them is, and we feel this is number one, is the positive attitudes and beliefs. This is absolutely critical, and the attitudes and beliefs of the entire community are what create the educational system. An acceptance that every single child learns differently. Third, child-centered learning. Rather than the teacher standing in front of the classroom, we have the children who are the center. Trust and faith in the ability that children will learn no matter what. Choices for parents, children, and teachers. the entire community becoming involved in education. And this was an interesting fact. We found that schools with less than 400 children, class size is important, but schools with less than 400 children had a far greater success rate than those that had more. Experimental learning, where children can manipulate, explore, and experiment with their learning process. Understanding play as a learning tool, and I think this is something we have come very far away from. Children must use play. We watch them over and over again to reinforce, to build the neurons of the brain. Portfolios as a measurement tool rather than testing. Teachers that have worldly experience rather than certification and schooling. Integration of all kinds of students, at risk, handicapped, all socioeconomic and ethnic backgrounds. I'm going to give you just 20 of them today. Few specialists, and by that I mean to teacher population. The number of administrative personnel, the number of psychologists, the number of administrators for music programs, art programs, etc., are very diminished in successful schools because the emphasis and the focus is on the children and the children's responsibility. It takes away that responsibility from adults. Dramatically modified teacher training programs, and you will hear a lot of this explained, which is why I'm going through it so quickly. Many of the people who are here today on the agenda will talk about many of these issues from their own schools. Students who are promoted by ability rather than by age or by grade. Now that's something even the laws need to be looked at, and I can't wait to see Representative Cowell because I'd like to ask him how we can possibly move to better education and move children by ability rather than by grade. Using textbooks, tests, and computers as tools rather than learning. Americans are obsessed with their tools, no matter what it is. If it's tests, we all run to try and get the highest test scores. If it's computers, everybody's got to have a computer in their classroom. Education as a privilege rather than a right. And by that I mean that is the perception of the people involved. David Lehman will be here talking about how he holds a lottery for students to get in. Can you imagine what it would be like in every school? What the crime level would be, the low attendance level, the attendance level would be when it is a privilege to go to school rather than a right. And I'm not saying that we need to take away the right of education, but it is the perception of education that we need to change. That character and values are part of students' training. That I remember we did a study many years ago on the one-room schoolhouses. We spent a great deal of time, and I was amazed at the McGuffey reader from the late 1800s, the early 1900s. Every single story that the child had to read referenced character, the character of a child. Survival skills training, and I don't mean that they need to go out in the wilderness, but I mean survival skills for life skills. We talk about over and over again how students who come out of school cannot balance their own checkbooks, don't know how to buy an insurance policy or purchase a home or their first car. See the child as whole human being rather than the sum of parts. And of course we come from the system we have today comes from the Cartesian model. And we need to take a look again, and you will hear this over and over again from the people who are here today, of looking at the child as a whole human being rather than the sum of the parts. And value the integrity of all life. So I picked 20 of the most critical elements to look at. And now I want you to take a look. Our emphasis is on learning strategies. So some of us have spent at Earth Heart Foundation, and you have in your folders, we only managed to put 3 pages in, but there are 5 members. There are 5 pages of all the members of the consortium, so I apologize for that. But we've spent 25 years across 7 states restructuring educational institutions. Through their experiences, we've determined that merely attempting to alter internal structures or external structures is ineffective. And after a year to 3 years, everyone returns to what is familiar and safe. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the Mary Tyler Moore structure. Do you remember the last episode of Mary Tyler Moore where everyone got in a huddle? You know, they did the group hug. I don't know if everybody remembers it. And then all of a sudden somebody needed a tissue, so the whole group kind of moved this way and moved this way. Well, that's what I call the Mary Tyler Moore structure. The structure of education has built such an impenetrable fortress over the last quarter of a century. The castle with its protective walls has difficulty moving with the changes in our culture. Legislators create legislation that imposes itself on the structure. So what happens? The structure shifts itself. That's all it does. It just merely shifts to another direction. School boards create rules and regulations, policies and procedures. Takes the structure and it merely moves it to another direction. In an attempt to affect education by passing laws, legislators attempt to try and have everyone conform, unify, and modernize education. In their attempts, all that really happens is just a shift in the structure. With dwindling resources, institutions now have to follow the flow of money through grants and partnerships. Rather than flowing with whatever the internal structure might be, we follow the revenues, which might be anything from programs for the handicapped. I receive internet, I'm on the internet and receive all the grants that are accessible. And right now, the #1 funding project is for prisons. So everybody starts to create projects for the prisons. And we continuously shift our focus rather than staying to whatever the internal focus of the organization might be. This sense of internal focus is not derived without commitment, time, and energy on the part of all concerned. And I mean legislators, superintendents, principals, teachers, students, parents, local community, and business. And I know it sounds like an awesome task, and it is. We didn't get to this place yesterday. It took us 100 years to get here. Without ownership, especially from the teachers, change is only temporary. Everyone must have a vested interest in the success of their school. Any new or innovative program derived and developed from the outside only has a brief lifetime. To build a climate for change for the local community, the outside shell must become fluid. The barriers to change, which are the number of things depending on the community, are what need to be addressed. Whether the stumbling blocks are relationships with the press in the schools, the senior citizens in the schools, the aesthetic environment in the schools, all of these need to be addressed to plant the seeds for change, because education reflects the culture of the community. One of these stumbling blocks, in order to diminish the stumbling blocks, we have developed the reconstruction process. And I think Mary Jean will probably talk about some of these things because her school is only 2 years old, and she's here to talk about how to start new schools, whereas everyone else has been in business for about the last 25 to 28 years. The first decisions about curriculum design have been, the steps in construction are building a self-sustaining environment to improve the learning process, understanding learning, these are the different steps we take, organize it into a structure, observe it at intervals, invest in a knowledge base, and coaching all the principal players. That's all part of the reorganization process. Following that are developing learning strategies, altering attitudes and beliefs, and emphasizing whole child, child-centered learning. Now each one of these in themselves is a course. But I'm going to try and attempt here to explain what we are talking about. What happens in our organizational structure is I'm going to break it down a little bit more. Building a self-sustaining environment. You need to understand first, everyone within the school district, begin with the end in mind. Where do you want to go? And by you, I'm talking about where do each individual group of players want to go. Because if I talk to the school board members here, and I talk to the superintendents that are here present, they're going to tell me two different directions. If I talk to parents, they're going to tell me something different. If I talk to the students, they want something different. The ability to restructure a school is an attempt to answer these questions within your school. What do you want? And I can tell you from everyone in our consortium, what we have discovered in 25 years is that school districts do not know what they want. They have followed the money and the flow of money for so long that they have lost their center. And this is where we need to get back to. What's the mental model you wish to achieve? Where are you? Where is your school now? What do you think you want? And this is a critical question. Are you really serious about the process? Do you have the willingness to change the way you perceive learning? Are all of the players willing to change? And what are the symptoms, issues, and concerns? Because in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, is very different than in Philadelphia, the concerns and the interest and the issues. And the idea that we create legislation for schools across an entire state and across an entire nation may not be the appropriate way to go. What are the possibilities? And today, that's what we're going to talk about, the possibilities. We're going to look at schools that are successful and how we can incorporate these ideas across the state of Pennsylvania. What our new model looks like is something like this. We take those that create the laws, the legislators, the local legislators, the school boards, and the superintendents, and we ask them these questions. What do you want? Then we take the principals, the teachers, the students, the business community, and we ask them what they want. And it's a process. What we do is we come to an overall agreement on what we really want for the children in that school district, state, whatever it is. And it's a process because everybody wants something different. Within the process of this restructuring, literally the structure changes as the process unfolds. And what we come with is a brand new structure for that school district. And it looks totally different than what it did before. Because now we are not focused on the wall, we are focused on what the individuals in that community want. And then we bring in people, consultants, to help them get to that point. I have this great story I love to tell. There were a group of educators who were searching in the jungle. And they were walking around and walking around. And finally, one of the superintendents said, you know, it doesn't feel like we're getting anywhere. So he climbed up a tree and he looked around as his colleagues were moving around at the bottom. And he yelled down to them, "We're in the wrong jungle." And the rest of the educators yelled up, "That's okay, we're making progress." And somehow, that's the idea of what we see in education across the United States, the appearance of what we think is progress. But our goals and our objectives need to be shifted to a different place, which is a focus on learning. Schools keep replicating their practices over and over and over again. It might be called a different name. It might be called strategies. It might be called standards of learning. It might be called literacy testing. It's all the same thing over and over again. They are just tools. We need to work towards a work-effort model. We constantly work towards this bell-shaped curve in education, rather than what I consider this model, which is a work model. And you're going to hear from the people today and this weekend on the work-effort model, because many of them have it. We need to stop reacting to what is, test scores, standards of learning, teacher salaries, and shift to what you want to create. Because if you trust the process, if you really trust the process, if you trust that children will learn no matter what, which is the truth, then you can shift. Your center has to be positive. I noticed that as I'm in this valley that there's a lot of comments on negative issues around here, teacher salaries being one of them. We've got to stop focusing on all those negative issues and start looking at what can we do to affect better education. Because what happens is when you begin to work through this process I was talking about, what people find out is their problems are not really problems. They're just misperceptions. And most of the time, misperceptions come from miscommunication. There's one thing Americans are really good at that I've discovered over the years: not listening. And we all need to learn how to listen much more effectively in order for change to happen. As I was saying, the state must support the schools and not legislate them. What's good for Shamokin is not good for Philadelphia. What's good for Wilkes-Barre is not good for Pittsburgh. So legislators really, and Congressman Kanjorski and I have had conversations, as well as I've been to the House of Representatives here in Pennsylvania. I will be speaking before the House of Representatives on education in Pennsylvania. And we have been doing a tremendous amount of looking at how legislation impacts schools, local schools and local communities. There's no way of going backwards. I mean, we can't just throw out all the laws. But perhaps there are ways, and in fact there are ways, of being able to make innovations without having to do that. One of the keys is that pilot schools, magnet schools, hold the best chance for success because they include educators, students, businesses, and parents who are choosing to make a difference. If you're constantly trying to change within your school districts by having one or two classes that stand out, it takes a longer period of time for change to happen than it does when you can isolate a school and have everybody look at this model and say, this is what we need, this is where we need to go.